Okay, so next piece is talking about negotiation as an art form, and a little bit about dealing with an underperforming vendor. So I'm going to do a couple of slides and then hand it over to Jeremy to talk about the negotiation part. So first part, dealing with an underperforming vendor. Not that this ever happens. So first part, it's a test of the relationship. You know, you really show, it's a real proof point about whether this is an effective and trusting relationship is when things get into problems. Somebody's having an issue, how do you deal with it? So in a way, all of the work that you do building the relationship during the good times is in preparation for when the good times are not there anymore. You know, that's really sort of, you're trying to build capital over the course of the relationship. And I know that's, you know, as a vendor perspective, that's what we always try and do. You know, that's why you sort of have the honeymoon period where you'll get stuff for free from the vendor, because they want to build up those brownie points so they can cash them in later on. And it's something that both parties can do. One concept we like to use is this concept of leading versus lagging indicators. So in a sense, the project schedule is a lagging indicator. It tells you what has happened. And status reports are generally like that. The schedule can be useful as a leading indicator to forecast what will happen if it's a well-done schedule. You know, if it has the dependencies in it and you've got a proper critical path and all the rest of it. But there are other things that happen on projects that have nothing to do with the schedule that are often indicators that something may be amiss. On the vendor side, I mean, things like, you know, people rolling off the project in an unexplained manner or very suddenly. Sudden schedule slippage, you know, things being late that you weren't expecting to be late. Unexpected decreases in quality are all things we see a lot of. On the state side, something that one of our government advisors brought up, which I'd never thought of, but one thing that he monitors a lot is the amount of sick leave that state staff are taking. He sees that as an indicator of stress on the project team, and he's noticed before when state staff start to take a lot of sick leave, that's a sign that something's wrong, and something to be investigated. So I thought that was interesting. One of the key things, I mean, maybe the key message out of this, if you get into a situation where it's potentially turning adversarial, or at least people are starting to look at the contractual obligations and people aren't meeting those obligations, whoever has the most documentation wins, as a rule. If you have a halfway competent vendor, they will be documenting everything. You may not get to see much of that documentation. You know, when I'm doing projects, we take minutes on everything. I save every single email that's ever been sent, and we keep that stuff because it comes in useful. And I assume most of the vendors you're dealing with will do the same if they have their act together. And so it's incumbent upon the state to try and do the same thing. And that's where a contract management organization within the project is really critical. You know, I think we have some projects that are really well staffed in that area. I've seen some others that haven't had a strong contract management group within the project, and I think they've suffered because of it, because they haven't had a group of people who are focused on this part of the project. So, anything anybody wants to say about particular instances of underperforming vendors that either agrees with this, or is there anything that's sort of a big issue that we haven't talked about? Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the effective use of IPOC and IV&V. And we do this kind of work. I mean, that's a lot of what Grant Thornton does. So we sort of see it as a deliverer of it, as well as, you know, have some perspective from our government advisory board as consumers of the service. First thing to say is, you know, if you have an IPOC and IV&V vendor, they're a vendor. So everything we've talked about applies to them just as much as it applies to anybody else. But the other thing is they are a risk management tool. I mean, they can be a real utility in helping you manage risk if you use them as such. Our perspective generally is that the critical success factors for an effective, you know, IPOC and IV&V role, sort of four things. Like, you need a vendor who's got, you know, good experience and sort of can look forward and see things that might be about to happen on the project based on their professional experience. They have to have the ability to communicate that to you in a way that's actually going to resonate with people. they have to have expertise to recommend a practical course of action about what to do about this that isn't just, shooting arrows and telling you where things are wrong, but also giving you some sense of this is how to make it better. And then the fourth one is they need the trust of executive management, and that executive management has to be willing to act on those recommendations. And I lay those out because the first three of them are really about the IPOC and IV&V vendor. The fourth one is about the state. And this is my personal opinion. But what I've seen, I think, where IPOC and IV&V haven't necessarily been effective, it's not so much being that the IPOC and IV&V haven't been saying many of the right things, but they either didn't have the right audience to say it to, or people were hearing it but not really doing anything about it. And so if there's a message from us on this piece, it's the governance structure and the culture on the project has as much to do with the success of the IPOC and IV&V role as it does with the vendor itself. You can have the best vendor in the world, but if they're buried down somewhere in the project where they can't get access to executive leadership, they're probably not going to be very effective. So that's sort of a balance, and to the extent you are thinking about RFPs for IPOC and IV&V, for example, the governance structure around it, we think, is critical. And where that organization sits can have a big impact on how effective they can be in their role.
So I think that's a really good point, because I've been on several projects, and in the beginning of my project work, IPOC and IV&V, they were the ones to put in the corner and make sure you don't tell anything to, right? Whereas I've seen that change over the last few years, and it's actually exciting, because to get the vendor on so that they can tell you what you're doing wrong, so that you can see how to avoid any problems that may come up in the future, I think is a true benefit to the project. So I like that you point that out.
Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do now is pass it over to Jeremy. So Carlos, you have a...
So Graeme, can I add something to it in terms of leveraging IPOC, and particularly the ones that come out of my shop? One other role that they can play for you if you're on a project and you're having issues with a vendor, oftentimes they can be a liaison to getting you some assistance, particularly for my shop, but other organizations within government. And what I mean by that is I've seen projects where they start having problems with their vendors, where it seems like the vendor's not listening to them, or maybe your project isn't just high up on their radar screen. You seem to be getting a C team rather than an A team. A lot of times our IPOC consultants are the ones that can kind of bring my office into it, to where we can go and lean on a vendor for you, or at least give you some coaching or some ideas as to, look, here's how you address it. I won't say which project, but recently we had a project where there were quality issues, and there was scheduling and other sorts of issues where they needed to go in and bring the vendor in and start to essentially work with them to make some changes to the contract, but also to get them to commit to some things. And they were having some problems with that. So our IPOC alerted the rest of my shop. We were able to, one, go lean on the vendor for them, but then also coach them as they went into doing some discussions and negotiations with the vendors. So they were very well prepared when they went in. So that's another role that your IPOC and IV&V resources can play for you, is to bring you, either to the attention of or bring you some additional help when you need it.
That's a good point.